A warning. This podcast contains descriptions of sexual and family violence and self-harm, which some listeners may find disturbing. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-RESPECT.
The Three Faces of Eve.
There are three characters in Three Faces of Eve who occupy one body.
Maybe he wants to get Bonnie away from me. If he could make me believe I'm losing my mind.
Well, I never seen you take a drink before.
Honey, there are a lot of things you never seen me do before. There's no sign I don't do. Please, Mama, please don't make me.
This is a true story of the most completely documented case of multiple personality in the history of medicine.
The Three Faces of Eve was a 1957 Hollywood melodrama in which Joanne Woodward played a woman who had suffered such terrible childhood trauma that she developed three separate personalities. It's the movie that introduced the world to the psychiatric condition we now call dissociative identity disorder, or DID. In the 1950s, it was an illness that was rarely reported, and it went by a much simpler name, multiple personality disorder. Today, DID is diagnosed in thousands of people around the world, and it's a subject of major controversy in the mental health field. It's the illness depicted in recent movies such as Split and television dramas like United States of Tara.
I'm not sure if Mom's here. Mom's here, but I don't know if Mom's here.
It's the condition that Cheryl Bornhauser described to us in episode 4, when she recalled how she developed multiple personalities while experiencing false memories of satanic abuse in the 1990s.
They were all dressed in their black cloaks, praying to Satan. They had an animal they had slaughtered and they bled that animal, and we all had to drink the blood. So that was one memory.
It's also the psychiatric condition that Emily Johnson was suffering when she testified against her mother and father in the New South Wales District Court, accusing them of terrible abuse and torture. But as you're about to hear, the jury that convicted her parents was never actually told why DID is so controversial and how it might have influenced Emily Johnson's memories of her childhood. Her mother, who's now serving a 16-year sentence for child abuse, says she struggles to understand how that happened.
I was absolutely stunned at why nothing was being asked about her treatment in the hospital, what sort of therapy she had, all these sorts of things. Nothing. I was very distressed because we were alarmed, why we had no defence, basically, and yeah.
I'm Richard Guilliatt, and this is Shadow of Doubt, Episode 7, The Worst of the Worst.
It's become very apparent in every study of series of patients with DID that the vast majority of them give a history of being sexually, physically, emotionally abused or emotionally deprived from an early age, usually well before the age of 8, and with abuses continuing for a long period of time.
That's the Brisbane psychiatrist, Dr. Warwick Middleton, speaking on ABC Radio 2 years ago.
So a child who doesn't have a developed sense of identity at a young age is being physically or sexually or emotionally abused, usually all three, and they have no way of escape from the people who are their primary caregivers but also their primary abusers. So in this double bind, that the only way you can not go crazy or suicide is to find a way of compartmentalising trauma at the same time as eking out some sort of relationship with a poor attachment figure.
Dr. Middleton is one of the many psychiatrists around the world who treats patients suffering from multiple personalities and who believes their condition is caused by childhood trauma. He argues that DID is an extreme form of amnesia in which a child not only represses the memory of trauma, but stores it in the subconscious, in the form of an alter personality which may emerge years later as the memories return. Another high-profile advocate of this view is Dr. Kathy Kesselman, who was herself diagnosed with DID in her 40s when she recovered memories of her father and grandmother participating in ritual child murder in a cave in Brisbane. Today, Dr. Kesselman is head of the Blue Knot Foundation, an influential counselling and support organisation which co-manages Australia's federally funded National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. Here she is from that same ABC radio program.
We all have parts. It's just people with DID, dissociative identity disorder, have those parts very separate from one another. And so one part may not know the other part at all and may not know the main person who occupies the body. And it can be incredibly confusing and frightening for people as they struggle with losing time, struggle with different voices speaking who they don't know, and struggle to make sense of their own world. And when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense that the brain can actually divide itself up into bite-sized chunks and separate overwhelming material. And so it actually protects the child.
But there is an alternative view of DID, which is that it's a pseudo-illness created by therapy itself. That's broadly the view of Alan Francis, one of America's most eminent psychiatrists, and the author of several books on mental illness. He believes DID is a genuine condition in very rare cases, but he says the vast majority of patients today have fallen into its symptoms through exposure to bad counselling, pop culture, and the countless numbers of DID sufferers who now share their stories online, like this one.
Hi, welcome to a day in the life of somebody with dissociative identity disorder. It's 8:30 in the morning. I'm pretty sure Asher woke up and got coffee and I just switched in.
In a nutshell, Dr. Francis believes the illness creates traumatic memories, not the other way around. And his opinion carries weight because he was in charge of the committee which approved DID's inclusion in the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry nearly 30 years ago. That's a decision he deeply regrets, as he made clear when I spoke to him recently by phone from his home on the west coast of the US.
Well, I was closely involved in this debate. I was the head of the DSM-4 task force. I myself felt that it should be eliminated from the system. But we had rules for making decisions about whether a diagnosis should be included or not included in the system. And to add a diagnosis, you had to have compelling evidence. And to remove a diagnosis, you had to have compelling evidence. And we felt that it was very hard to prove that this doesn't happen. It was easy to prove that it's diagnosed too much because of the fad nature of it, but impossible to prove that it would never make sense to have in the system at all.
Dr. Francis believes that decision fueled the spread of DID, an illness that he directly links to the broader controversy about the reliability of repressed memories from childhood.
And for the people who are strong proponents of multiple personality disorder, the idea is that the therapeutic session helps the person recover memories that previously were locked away, and that the therapy is freeing up memories that are accurate of events that actually happened. Now, the problem with this line of thinking, although it may in some people be true, that if the therapist believes that most of adult psychopathology is caused by childhood sexual abuse, then they probe for these memories. And in the probing are suggesting that they must be there. The patients will often find the memories, partly maybe to explain their own distress, partly to please the therapist. It's a compelling narrative. When you see the movie, when you go to a weekend workshop, it's sort of a nice, neat explanation. What happens in actual fact is that very rarely do the alters reduce a number. The notion that the therapy is helping to integrate the person's previous experience doesn't seem to pan out very well in actual practice. And what this results in is very long treatments where more and more alters emerge. And it feels to me that in most instances, if not all instances, it's more an iatrogenic harm done by the treatment than the treatment actually helping the individual.
During her years of psychiatric treatment, Emily Johnson had received several diagnoses from her psychiatrist, Dr. Marie Warner, including obsessive-compulsive disorder and dissociative disorder not specified. By the time Emily gave evidence in court against her parents, she'd been in treatment for 6 years, and Dr. Warner had decided she was suffering from DID, caused by the horrendous torture and abuse that she described. Whether Emily ever displayed different, distinct personalities is unclear from Dr. Warner's reports, but the psychiatrist did note that Emily would sometimes speak in the voice of a child when she became dissociated. She would relive the sexual assaults as if they were actually happening again. Her pupils would dilate and she would have difficulty speaking. Her illness was the central issue that Martin and Susan Johnson's original solicitor, Andrew Bale, planned to fight the case on. He was going to argue that Emily had experienced memories of events that never happened, even though she might believe they had. Her treatment records showed she hadn't mentioned anything about her father's assaults until after 6 months of counselling, and her memories of his abuse had become increasingly extreme as her therapy continued. A forensic psychiatrist, Dr. John Roberts, and the prosecution's own medical expert, Dr. Maria Nittis, had agreed to testify for the defence, warning that the allegations could be unreliable. Emily's friend Tara had signed an affidavit stating that Emily herself had acknowledged that she repressed all her memories of abuse until adulthood. To Andrew Bale, these were the foundations of the defence case.
Certainly those things, the report of Dr. Nittis, the report of Dr. Roberts, and the statement from the friend, I couldn't imagine running this trial without putting those things into evidence. I couldn't see how you had realistic prospects of success without doing that.
But that strategy changed dramatically after Legal Aid New South Wales, for financial reasons, appointed new defence lawyers several months before the trial began. The Johnsons' new solicitor initially told the court he did intend to raise the repressed memory issue, and he'd been briefed on it by a lawyer from Andrew Bale's team. But shortly before jury selection began, the Johnsons' new legal team emailed prosecutors to say they were abandoning that approach. They wouldn't call Dr. John Roberts as a witness, or Tara, and they wouldn't challenge the psychiatric evidence. Susan Johnson says she wasn't aware of any of this, or that the psychiatrist, Dr. Roberts, had even agreed to testify, because she was still living outside Sydney at the time and hadn't attended many of the pre-trial hearings.
Like, I've never even knew what recovered memory was or repressed memory, and all I kept saying was we have to run the mental health angle. I didn't know what it was called. I just knew we had to go down that road.
Before their trial, the Johnsons had few opportunities to meet their new solicitor, who at that time was involved in one of the biggest organised crime cases in the country. The Johnson case itself had become massive. There were 89 charges, more than 100 potential witnesses, 80 prosecution statements, multiple medical, psychiatric and forensic reports, hours of recorded telephone intercepts, and hundreds of pages of other sundry evidence, phone records, immigration files, photos, diaries, police notebooks, school reports, sports results, emails and Facebook messages. Emily's treatment records alone ran to about 1,000 pages. But Susan Johnson's barrister suddenly withdrew from the case a week before the trial was scheduled to start, and a new one had to be hastily appointed. The new barrister didn't begin reading the medical and counselling records until he was standing before the judge a week before the trial's rescheduled opening. He said he was struggling to understand the handwritten notes. Martin Johnson's barrister, meanwhile, told the court that he'd barely touched the surface of the case 2 days before an important pre-trial hearing about the medical evidence. The Johnsons say their new solicitor rarely appeared in court and handed the case to a junior lawyer from his office who had only just started practicing. Martin Johnson says he had always assumed that the psychiatric issues would be a key part of the case.
I managed to get a whole lot of articles sent in on dissociative identity, PTSD, repressed memory, false memory, etc. And I had written out about 6 pages which clearly outlined step by step what the research says and what the research had claimed about the fact that someone suffering from dissociative identity cannot give accurate information.
Of course, it's not uncommon for people who've been convicted to be unhappy about the way their lawyers represented them. Accused people are often bewildered by the criminal justice system and the rules of court proceedings. I contacted the Johnsons' former lawyers to find out why they switched course so soon before the trial began. But their solicitor didn't respond to my messages, and the barristers told me they had no interest in discussing the case. Susan Johnson's barrister said it was one of the most distressing cases he'd ever handled, and he didn't like thinking about it. But documents I found left over from the trial shed some light on what happened. Shortly after Martin Johnson's barrister was appointed, he emailed the instructing solicitor and said he believed Emily Johnson was suffering from false memories of abuse. He speculated that her memories of abuse could have something to do with the fact that when she was young, her bedroom had been visited by Bill Newman, the swimming coach who had groomed and molested her sister Sarah. That was exactly what Emily's parents believed and what they had suggested to police years earlier. But the lawyers faced problems raising all this in court. The false memory argument was tricky because Emily Johnson had signed a statement flatly denying she had ever experienced repressed memories. She said she'd always remembered the abuse, but only realised it was wrong in her late teens. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Warner, vouched for her reliability. And Emily's illness, DID, was a legitimate condition backed by the official psychiatric manual. Prosecutors had lined up their own expert psychiatrist to explain all that. And on top of all that, the lawyers would face difficulties even mentioning Bill Newman's sexual offending against Sarah because questions about an alleged victim's prior sexual history are now strictly curtailed. Faced with all this, it appears that the Johnsons' lawyers opted for a simpler approach. They told prosecutors they wouldn't raise the issue of Bill Newman or repressed memories. Instead, they would try to convince the jury that Emily and Sarah Johnson were simply lying. Susan Johnson remembers her barrister confidently predicting that no jury would believe that her daughter could have been tortured and abused for 13 years without anyone noticing.
No one's going to believe her anyway. That was his approach, like, we don't need evidence, no one's going to believe her.
Her daughter Rebecca recalls a similar conversation with the instructing solicitor while sitting outside the courtroom at an early hearing.
He came up to me and apologised for being late and basically sat down and he just said, well, this is ridiculous. If she wanted anyone to believe her, she wouldn't have made up such ridiculous, impossible allegations. And basically I looked at him, I said, well, yes, but instantly I was like, so what are we going to do with this? And he was very frantic. He didn't even look at me as he sat there, and he took a call to another client that had just been locked up, and he says, I'm so sorry, I've got to go. And that was it. That was the conversation I had with the appointed new lawyer. And then all I dealt with was a junior lawyer that was still studying and was often too busy to take my calls because she was sitting the exams.
To Susan Johnson, the dangers of their lawyer's approach became obvious from the first day of evidence, when Emily appeared on a video screen testifying from a nearby room in the court building. It had been more than 3 years since she had last encountered her daughter, looking lost and bedraggled on a country road near their home.
And she presented very well on the screen, and I was in complete shock. She was very composed, very responsive. She called the DPP by her first name. She was wearing like a lawyer outfit, and her hair was done nicely. She came across as very well, spoken. As I say,
the crimes that Emily was accusing her parents of were so extensive and extraordinary that it would take 8 days for the Crown prosecutor to draw out her testimony. As her parents sat in the dock, Emily began by describing her memory of her father raping her in bed at the age of 5, while her siblings slept in nearby rooms. She recalled searing pain from that assault, which left her bleeding and struggling to walk. She recounted him bashing her and dragging her to the creek as a 6-year-old before tying her up in the shed for 3 nights. In this podcast, we're going to use the voices of actors to recreate what happened in the trial. Here is an excerpt from some of Emily's testimony on her first day in court, when she recalled her earliest memory of her father torturing her in the shed when she was 8, during a Christmas when the whole family was at home.
I was absolutely terrified that I was going to die and that he was going to leave me in there to die. I remember yelling out in pain because I was in excruciating pain. He then picked up some scissors and I felt what I thought was him cutting my vagina. I remember the pain in my legs jolting because of how bad it was. Awful, just instant stinging pain. I remember him saying to me when he was doing that all he's ever tried to do is be a good father. And I don't know what he meant by that, but I just remember him saying that.
Emily's demeanour, as she testified, was unusual. She appeared to lose contact with her surroundings at times. The judge began talking to her during these spells, explaining to the prosecutor that she was concerned that Emily might drift off entirely.
I notice at times she seems, to use a doctor's terminology, to dissociate when there are long pauses. When you speak to her again, she re-engages, but I didn't want her to display some behaviour, like fall off the chair or something, which would not be good for anybody, least of all the accused. That's why I continue to engage with her in those pauses.
The Johnsons say they watched their daughter rapidly deteriorate as she began to struggle through her evidence. To them, she appeared heavily medicated. And on the second day, she faltered for the first time while describing her mother sexually assaulting her at home when she was 9. The hearing was suddenly stopped, and Susan Johnson recalls her alarm when the prosecutor announced that Emily had gone missing after reporting that she felt faint.
When she came to the allegations on me, I remember very clearly that's when she fell apart. She really, really struggled with that, and I knew why, because that she was just completely struggling with saying these things. As she went on, of course, I became so concerned, and I said, "Please check on her," which they found unusual because I'm sitting there as the accused, but I could see that she was really struggling, and I thought she was in danger of her own life, giving this evidence that was untrue. She did really deteriorate many times, and they just would stop it, or they would go up to her in whatever the room she was in. And I remember asking my barrister, I said, "Is that even allowed?" I remember him saying, "Oh, they'll be all running up there, probably drugging her and getting her ready for the net." That's how he said it to me. And I was absolutely shocked at how she was just allowed to stop and start, and it was like they'd rehearsed her. It was like she was reading from a script.
Day by day, Emily recounted her memories of torture and abuse. She described how she had twice buried her father's torture implements on the property, once when she was 14 and again when she was 17. She corroborated the story her sister Sarah and her grandmother had told police, about a massage incident in her grandmother's house. She said the photo of herself naked in her room had been taken by her father, not by her boyfriend. She described the orgy at home with her parents and recounted her father's sadistic assaults in dreadful detail. Here is one brief excerpt after the prosecutor asked her about being trapped in the shed.
And after your father had left and you remained, what did you do?
I stayed in there, and I remember later on that there was some blood on the ground, and I remember thinking that at that point I just felt like I was going to die. I felt like I wasn't going to get out of there. I was absolutely terrified, and I remember I got some of the blood and I tried to write something on a piece of wood, but there wasn't enough. So I remember I got up and I went to the front of the shed and found I'm not quite sure what it was, like a nail or something. And I went down to this piece of wood that was down the bottom of the shed and I engraved some stuff in there. I still had my hands, my wrists tied together, but I was still able to use my hand.
Do you remember what you wrote on the wood with the nail?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us what you wrote?
I wrote, "I'm trapped. Mum is coming. Dad. And we." And I kept going over and over it again.
And why were you doing that?
Because I was terrified. I was lonely and I thought I was going to die.
Emily's father remembers watching all this unfold on the video screen.
It was incredibly upsetting. You know, I have a lot of love for I still do. You know, it's yeah, sorry. It was horrible, you know. It was horrible to have to sit there and watch it. You know, to think that this girl might actually believe that some of these horrible things happened and they just didn't happen.
By the 8th and final day of the prosecutor's questions, 3 of the hearings had been cut short because Emily was unable to continue. The Johnsons' lawyers faced an obvious dilemma: how to challenge her evidence without creating emotional scenes that would alienate the jury. Martin Johnson's barrister began by taking her slowly through her many achievements as an athlete. But as soon as he asked her about a specific incident of abuse, Emily became so distressed that the hearing had to be stopped temporarily. In the end, the barrister opted to simply list each of her dozens of allegations and put it to her that the events never happened. Repeatedly, Emily simply asserted that they had. Susan Johnson's barrister took an identical approach during his 3 days of questioning, and the response was the same. Emily never wavered, depicting her life as one of misery and terror. She said she never had close friends and wasn't close to her sisters. The love she'd expressed for sport in interviews and to friends was a facade. She actually only pursued it because of her mortal fear of her father, which was so overwhelming she'd never told anyone about the torture she was suffering. She said she was so naive about sexual matters that at 14 she didn't really understand what ejaculating was, which explained the word "we" in her diary. At 17, she didn't know what the word paedophile meant, and had only just begun to realise that her father's behaviour was wrong. When she was shown a photo of the shed which she said she'd been imprisoned in, she agreed that it was visible from the house and that its interior was exposed to view by chicken wire which covered half of one side. The photos showed a plank of wood instead of a door, but she insisted it had had a lockable door and that she had been forced to cut a way out of it with pliers when she was 14. When she was challenged as to why she hadn't spoken to anyone, despite the terror she reported, she replied, "You don't quite understand. Nobody was ever allowed to question Dad. I believed that what he was doing to me was to make me tougher." By the time Emily's testimony finished, she'd been in the witness box for 16 days. The only medical evidence that supported her claims of brutal sexual assaults was the report of Dr. Christine Norrie. In court, Dr. Norrie repeated her belief that a tear in Emily's hymen must have been caused by blunt force trauma before puberty. She based this finding on the fact that a section of Emily's hymen was thin, indicating it had been damaged before her body had gone through the hormonal changes that are caused by estrogen. The doctor described the damage to Emily's hymen as grossly abnormal and resembling an injury from childbirth. She said the absence of any scarring, despite the savage and prolonged abuse that Emily reported over 13 years, did not strike her as unusual. Questioned by Martin Johnson's barrister, she gave the following answers.
You're fully aware of the allegations that have been made. You have read her statement, of course.
Yes.
And there is an allegation that tools were used. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And tools were used with force. They were inserted with force.
Yes.
Into her vagina repeatedly?
Yes.
On many occasions, yes?
Yes.
Now, Doctor, what I'm asking you is that armed with that knowledge, surely you would expect to find some scarring, not necessarily of the hymen, but inside the vagina area?
No, it always heals up really quickly. It's mucosa, it's not skin.
As they listened to this evidence, the Johnsons knew that they had a medical expert of their own ready to contradict it, Dr. Maria Nittis. You'll remember from the last episode that Dr. Nittis was a senior forensic specialist who had actually assisted Dr. Norrie in examining Emily for prosecutors. Her opinion, as we've heard, was that the tears in Emily's hymen could have been caused by consensual sex. But the Johnsons' lawyers wanted the prosecution to call Dr. Nittis as a witness, even though she'd written her report for the defence. It was a tactical move. Her evidence would have more weight if she appeared as a witness for the other side. But when the DPP refused to call her, Dr. Nittis simply never appeared. The lawyers later signed statements saying they thought it was unnecessary for them to call Dr. Nittis because Dr. Norrie had already acknowledged that she couldn't cite any research to back up her assertion that Emily's injury had occurred before puberty. Still, it's not hard to imagine the impact that Dr. Norrie's evidence about grossly abnormal injuries might have had on the jury. When I interviewed Dr. Nittis years later, she made it clear that had she testified, her evidence would have strongly refuted the prosecution case. Dr. Norrie told the court, well, I'll just read the quote to you. What she's got are gross injuries. They're not just a simple one transaction. Sometimes with digital penetration, you do get one transaction, but it's not nearly as severe as what she's got. This sort of appearance of the hymen is mostly seen in women who have had babies. Do you agree with that?
No, not as that statement stands. I think Dr. Kathy Lincoln did some research more than 10 years ago now looking consensual versus non-consensual injuries. And I think one of her findings was that actual digital penetration was more likely to cause more injury than penile penetration. But of course, there are a lot of variables involved in that. You know, it depends whether you've got a willing partner, whether you've got lubrication, a whole lot of things at play. I don't think you can look at that from an examination of a woman who is now an adult and then determine that, you know, how many penetrations have occurred or at what stage they occurred.
So gross injuries, that's not a phrase that you would use to describe this?
No.
You did write a report for the defence and ultimately you weren't called to testify. So the jury never had the benefit of hearing any other medical evidence as to injury in the case. Does that concern you?
I think in an adversarial system, you've got the opportunity to look at different points of view or different evidence. So I think the fact that my opinion was, you know, different from Dr. Norrie's in some ways, I think in the interest of fairness, perhaps both should have been provided. But of course, you know, that's with the disclaimer that I haven't had access to all the information that was put before the court or their legal teams.
Does it surprise you that you weren't called given the contents of your report?
I'm never surprised about whether I'm called or not called in court. Sometimes they don't call you because they've got what they need from the one witness that has appeared, and they don't really need anything else subsequently. The fact that the defence team didn't call me, it would be a little hard to believe they got everything from Dr. Norrie that they may have wanted. But, you know, again, I don't have access to all the discussions that went on around that.
Dr. Nittis was not the only expert that the Johnsons' lawyers didn't bring to court. During the trial, the prosecution called a soil scientist who had examined the rusty tools that police had dug up from the family property. You'll recall from previous episodes that Emily's diary, the one she said she kept as a 14-year-old, described how she had buried the tools her father was using to torture her. The soil scientist, Professor Robert Fitzpatrick, had examined the corrosion on the tools and concluded they must have been buried for more than 3 years. He also believed that the rust was likely to have been created by the soil from the surrounding area. That testimony supported the prosecution's account of a terrified young girl hiding evidence of her father's violence. The Johnsons' previous lawyers had commissioned a report from an expert engineer, Dr. Duncan Gilmore, who completely disagreed with those findings and called them illogical. Dr. Gilmore pointed out that there were distinct chemical differences between the composition of the rust and the soil, and that Professor Fitzpatrick himself had said they had limited comparability. Martin Johnson's barrister had clearly read Dr. Gilmore's report because his questions to Professor Fitzpatrick raised those very issues. But Dr. Gilmore himself was never called to give evidence in the trial. The witness who followed Dr. Norrie was Emily's psychiatrist, Dr. Marie Warner. Dr. Warner told the court that she had conducted around 1,000 hours of psychotherapy with Emily over the previous 6 years, and that her case was a complex combination of post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative identity disorder. Emily herself had denied ever having any repressed memories, but Dr. Warner's explanation of DID appeared to confirm that Emily's memories of abuse had been blocked out until adulthood.
So it is a disorder in which people block out trauma memories to survive, and if they dissociate and block out enough times, they develop these discrete individual states, parts of themselves, and different ones with different memories. So one part might contain the trauma memory, another part might be the part of the person that has to pretend everything is all right the next day and hop on the bus and go to school. So they have these different self states that have different roles and may have different memories and different pain tolerance and different thoughts and different feelings. The dissociation, I believe, is from the betrayal trauma, so that Emily, for example, needing to believe that her mother loved her, needing to believe that her mother would protect her at some point. She needed hope to survive, and so she needed to block off that, in fact, her mother wasn't going to help her, was unable to help her, didn't help her, knew what was going on, sometimes joined in. She needed to block that off, that betrayal, and that is dissociation.
Dr. Warner supported what Emily had told police, that it wasn't until her late teens that she had realised her family life was abnormal. The psychiatrist told the court that when Emily was sexually assaulted overseas, it had made her aware that what her parents had been doing to her for years was wrong. A Supreme Court judge would later describe this testimony as manifestly improbable. But Martin Johnson's barrister didn't challenge it, nor any of the other evidence the psychiatrist gave. In fact, he only asked her 8 questions. Neither barrister would contest Dr. Warner's evidence. Martin Johnson says that at this point in the trial, his relationship with his legal team began to break down.
So I just could not understand why they were not calling Dr. Roberts. You know, a forensic psychiatrist, fairly well renowned, with a lot of expertise in this area. a lot of knowledge about the therapies and also the business of repressed memory and false memory. Well, I was flabbergasted, to put it mildly. I just had no capacity to make any contact with the legal team outside of the trial. They rarely came to see me downstairs, even on days when I turned up and was the jury member missing from illness, which happened a few times. And I'd be sitting downstairs in the holding cells all day. No one would come to see me. So I knew things weren't good, and I knew that they were out of their depth. I wanted the trial to be aborted, but I had no idea how to do that.
The prosecution called 10 witnesses who knew the family, none of whom remembered seeing any sign of the sexual violence Emily described. A neighbour did recall finding Susan Johnson at home one day, seemingly drunk, during the years of her depression. And a friend of Emily's said she once saw Martin Johnson angrily whip his daughter's legs with a skipping rope. But the most damaging evidence came from Emily's grandmother and her sister, Sarah. They both testified about the incident in the grandmother's house when the three sisters were said to have massaged their father while he was aroused. Susan Johnson's elderly mother, Margaret, said she had never forgotten it. She also recalled an incident when Sarah had become upset after her father asked her to remove her bra during a sports massage. Sarah herself gave evidence over 4 days, telling the jury her father had sexually aroused her when he massaged her in her early teens. Like Emily, she seemed to suggest that she only realised this was wrong later in life. She said she had blocked a lot of things out, and they only came to light for her at 19, after she had sexual experiences with boyfriends. Sarah had told police a very different story 5 years earlier, when she spoke to them about Bill Newman's sexual assaults. Back then, she had recalled that it was Newman who aroused her when he massaged her, beginning at the age of 13, and she had realised it was wrong by her mid-teens. But the Johnsons' lawyers had already agreed not to ask Sarah any questions about that, because it brought up her prior sexual history. In court, Sarah repeated her claim that her father had broken her nose during a violent attack, and that she had spent her childhood terrified of him. Asked about the many loving emails and messages she'd sent him throughout her childhood, she said, "He never knew that I hated him. I was too scared to tell him." At one point, Susan Johnson's barrister took Sarah through one of the loving messages that she'd sent to the whole family while living overseas in her late teens.
Do you see that in the first few lines? I really miss you all a lot. There are so many times that I wake up in the morning and I wish I could see you all and do all of the fun things that we do, like go running and stand in the icy cold creek. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I think you referred to Dad and a line or two on Mum. Do you see that?
I do see that, yes.
Mum, I'm very proud of your commitment to your sport, correct?
Yes, correct. I can see that.
Do you see about halfway down you've written, "So, if anything, this is just a small way of letting you all know I love you with every ounce of my heart and I'm thankful to have every one of you in my life"?
Yes, that's correct.
May we take it as a sincere sentiment?
Yeah, all I ever wanted was to be in a happy family. This depicts me as a child perfectly, the way I used to write and describe my family.
In court, Sarah agreed that Susan Johnson had been an amazing mother at times. Yet she also testified that her mother was a habitual drunk who talked about sex constantly, who'd conducted an inappropriate demonstration of masturbation, and who persistently ignored Sarah's pleas to do something about her father's sexual assaults. Sarah's mother, who insists that none of this is true, says she was stunned by her daughter's testimony.
But I was shocked at the way she could sit there with a coffee, in her hand on the screen, talking about, that disgusting incident of demonstrating masturbation, which just never happened. This whole drinking thing and this sex talk, I don't know where that's come from, and it's not that I don't drink alcohol, I don't deny that or anything like that. I just think that things have been grossly over-exaggerated and used in a really distorted and disturbed way towards me to make me a victim of my husband. I had to be this drunk on the couch, this woman who mistreated her children, you know, to convict him. They had to portray me as I had to be a victim of him, or else this wouldn't have stood up in court.
The prosecution called one final expert before closing its case, a forensic scientist who testified that the girl's underwear found in the shed was stained with Emily Johnson's blood. The Crown case had taken up 30 hearing days. The defence case would take 9. The Johnsons' lawyers called 4 friends of the family who testified that they never saw any sign of dysfunction. One of those was Peter, who we've heard from in this podcast. He had actually lived with the family for 6 months as a young man. He flew to Sydney towards the end of the trial, and he was surprised that the Johnsons' lawyers seemed to know so little about the family.
My impression was they knew nothing about me. I remember texting my wife to go, I'm not sure if they knew I was coming today. They didn't know that I'd lived with them. I don't think they knew that I was part of their training group. We had coffee together with the legal team and then went to a room in the courthouse to have a little pre-meeting, and it seemed like I was telling them things they didn't know about and they were surprised about. And yeah, it was like all this new information they'd never heard of.
The Johnsons had compiled a list of nearly 30 people who could have come to Sydney to testify, but they say their solicitor told them that legal aid couldn't shoulder the cost. So Emily's friend Kathy wasn't called, even though she could have disputed Sarah's allegation that her father had viciously bashed her nose one night in Kathy's home. The Johnson's son, Daniel, never got a chance to tell the jury that he had seen Emily's boyfriend taking the nude photo of her, not his father. Tara never appeared to give her account of how Emily had described her delayed recall of the sexual assaults. Nor did Emily's social worker, Donna, ever testify about how those memories emerged in counselling. Defence lawyers will usually call witnesses to support their client's good character, but in Martin Johnson's case, there was a problem. One of the rules of engagement in a criminal trial is that good character evidence can be challenged by the other side. And in this case, the prosecution could certainly have challenged it, because they could have called evidence from the women who alleged that Johnson had sexually assaulted them when they were high school students in the 1980s. That was deemed to be too big a risk for the defence lawyers to take, and it meant that the jury never heard anyone describe Martin Johnson's positive qualities. Instead, the Johnsons' lawyers put the couple themselves in the stand to make their own case of innocence to the jury. Reading the transcript, it's clear that Martin Johnson did not make a good impression. He admitted striking his children, and he said of Sarah, "She was always too quick for me. I never got her across the face." He was pulled up by the judge more than once for arguing with the prosecutor or failing to answer a question. And while he denied all the charges against him, he admitted that he'd been a neglectful father who never read his children a bedtime story. Susan Johnson recalls her own time in the witness box as a mistake. She says her lawyers failed to prepare her for the kind of hostile questioning she would face. Her daughter Rebecca also gave evidence, but prosecutors were ready to discredit her before she even got into the witness box. You'll remember from our last episode that 3 years earlier, Rebecca had reluctantly pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to influence Emily to drop the case, after Rebecca had helped rescue her sister from the roadside near their home. To this day, she insists she is innocent of that charge and that she only agreed to plead guilty because the delays on the case would have jeopardised her sports career. But she was warned that saying that in the witness box would risk a charge of perjury, and during a withering cross-examination by the prosecutor, she admitted that she had threatened her sister. When the jury started their deliberations after 48 hearing days, Susan Johnson was telling friends that she felt confident, but she admits she was putting a brave face on things.
When you believe in truth, you just believe they would have seen through it, you know, but underneath it, I was very, very concerned, obviously very concerned, but I guess just absolutely terrified, because I knew the alternative was going to prison, and that was not something that I was able to internalise or comprehend at all on any level. You don't want to believe that you're going to be found guilty of something that you've never ever done. You just don't believe it's ever going to happen. You just don't. You just think something will correct it. But instinctively, I was worried.
After jury deliberations that stretched over 2 weeks, it was announced on a Thursday morning that the verdicts had finally been reached. The jury foreperson sat as she methodically read out each of the charges in sequence, pronouncing Martin Johnson guilty on every one of the 73 counts he faced. Susan Johnson was found guilty of all but 3 of her 13 charges. I wasn't there that day in court, but others who were told me the couple looked completely stunned. Martin Johnson recalls that from the very first guilty pronouncement against himself, he knew that his wife would be going to prison as well.
Oh, it was awful. It was awful. When they found me guilty of the very first charge, which I've honestly believed that couldn't have happened, my first thoughts were, I thought straight away, my God, they're going to be as well. And that's...
The Johnsons' daughter Rebecca was sitting next to her mother when the verdicts were read.
It was the absolute moment of just shock, basically. At the worst, we thought hung jury. At the worst, because this was so horrific that people couldn't decide. And then you're guilty on every single thing. Like what the... I was absolutely mortified. And Mum she just deteriorated very quickly and terrified she was going to be taken. And
Susan Johnson remembers trying to be stoic as she was led down to the cells. She says her only contact with their solicitor from that time was a video call before the sentencing hearing, when he asked her to reveal candidly whether she had ever witnessed her husband sexually abusing their daughters. She says she was almost speechless, having spent the previous 6 months trying to convince her lawyers that none of the crimes they were accused of had happened. 2 months after the guilty verdicts, Emily and Sarah Johnson reappeared in court to present their victim impact statements. Sarah's 4-page statement was nearly entirely directed at her mother. She told Susan Johnson that she should be ashamed of herself, that she was an alcoholic who had refused to seek treatment, that she had betrayed her daughters and led Sarah into a life of utter destruction. She described her mother as the second most selfish human being she knew, behind her father. Emily's statement ran to 6 pages. She said every day of her childhood had been spent feeling terrified, scared and alone. Her father's evil behaviour and her mother's betrayal had made her childhood a living hell, and her adult life one of isolation, night terrors and paralysing fear. She was still consulting a psychiatrist twice a week and a counsellor once a week. She said every minute of every day was spent fighting constant flashbacks in which she relived the abuse. The day before Emily delivered this statement, she had appeared in a media interview, smiling and announcing her ambitions to move interstate and pursue new sporting endeavours. And on the day they delivered their statements, Sarah and Emily had taken a selfie, posing in their court clothes, arm in arm and smiling. They posted it on Facebook, prompting a comment from the magistrate who had become a friend of Emily's after committing her parents for trial. He wrote, "My heroes." A month later, the trial judge delivered her sentences. It took more than a day for her to catalogue each of the terrible crimes that the Johnsons faced jail over. The judge described Martin Johnson as a sadist whose depravity was almost unimaginable, and Susan Johnson as a mother who had betrayed her children's trust in the gravest way. Their daughter Emily, the judge said, had suffered catastrophic damage to her entire person, and her parents' continued protests of innocence demonstrated their lack of remorse.
There is no evidence to suggest even a modicum of remorse or insight on the part of the father into his offending. Indeed, he reoffended even after the victim had made a complaint to police and was seeking assistance from counsellors, and again when an apprehended violence order was in place. Simply put, he did what he did for his own completely selfish, depraved and sadistic reasons. No motivation can mitigate the heinous way he treated his daughter. The mother insists that all charges relating to the father are false. At present, the mother has no insight into her own conduct, and in all the circumstances it is hard to assess her attitude towards her offending. There is presently no evidence of any apparent remorse. It can only be hoped that over time that might change.
The judge sentenced Susan Johnson to 16 years jail with a non-parole period of 11 years. She sentenced Martin Johnson to 48 years with a minimum of 36 years. He would be 95 before he was eligible for release. During the 3 months that the Johnsons had been on trial, and throughout the previous 2.5 years of court hearings, not a word had been published in the media about the case. The proceedings had been entirely suppressed from early on in the magistrates' court hearings, and even after the Johnsons were found guilty, no journalist was given access to the evidence from the trial. After the jury's verdicts, the presiding judge lifted the suppression order to allow the media to attend court when Emily and Sarah read out their victim impact statements. Journalists returned to the court a month later when the judge herself delivered her damning sentencing remarks. The only document from the case she made available to journalists was a summary of the prosecution case. The media reports that flowed from this and spread around the world labelled the Johnsons as the most heinous child abusers Australia had known, the worst of the worst, as one newspaper headline put it. The harrowing details of the case were recounted in scores of news reports around Australia and overseas. The Washington Post, the Toronto Sun, the Independent in the UK, and media outlets in Russia, Asia, South Africa and the Middle East reported the extraordinary story of the sadistic Australian parents who had kept their daughter as a sex slave for 13 years. One website ranked the Johnsons as the 4th most evil parents in history, not far behind the British serial killers Fred and Rosemary West. The case was cited in academic journals and analysed by criminologists. Convicted paedophiles are at serious risk of assault from other inmates, and the Johnsons faced that threat more than most. They would be held in maximum security cells, among the worst criminals in the country. Susan Johnson recalls that even as she was being led from the courtroom to the transport truck after taking off all her jewellery, a guard had leaned in her ear with a malicious remark.
He said to me, "Going to be here a very long time. You better get used to this. They're going to have a ball with you." That's what he said to me. I was just terrified. I thought I was going to be raped. All the things I'd heard about prison, I got told I was going to be in this 3 by 4 metre cells in maximum security because of the charges. You would barely be let out. And I said, please, I just need somewhere to be able to, exercise. And they told me that I couldn't go into the main prison, but I couldn't go out to the big, the big ovals or anywhere like that because of the charges. They said that I would be attacked and, severely hurt if I went out there. And I still begged them. Luckily, I have a background of discipline, and I just knew something kicked in, that a survival, that I had to work out a routine that so I would just find a very small corner in the cell where I, just did hundreds and hundreds or thousands of push-ups and sort of cardio strength work with jogging on the spot and step up. That's how focused I became.
The Johnsons believed they had strong grounds for appeal, but that process would take years rather than months. During that time, their daughters Emily and Sarah both found new lives away from the community they'd grown up in. Sarah moved interstate and switched professions. Emily changed her surname twice and completed a university degree. During her time at uni, Emily got engaged to a fellow student, and in the photos she posted to social media, they looked happy as they hiked in the mountains or went skiing together. But then the engagement was broken off suddenly, and a new man appeared in her life, an older man. He also popped up in her social media feed, smiling as they bicycled together overseas or shared a romantic cabin in the bush. His face was familiar to those who knew the family, because Emily's new partner was her parents' old friend, Dave, the helpful police officer who'd taken an interest in her case right from the beginning.
Shadow of Doubt is a podcast investigation from The Australian. It's written and presented by Richard Guilliatt and produced and mixed by our multimedia editor, Lia Tsamoglou. I'm Editorial Director Claire Harvey, host of our daily news podcast, The Front, where you'll hear our journalists talking candidly about their stories. You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. Just say, play the news from The Australian to hear the latest episode. Subscribe to our channel CrimeX Plus on Apple Podcasts or search The Australian wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check out all our journalism anytime at theaustralian.com.au.
In the next episode of Shadow of Doubt.
So I just think he completely crossed all line of his duty as a police officer.
I can't anymore sit back. This never happened and I don't know what else to do. And these guys have kept my parents in jail.